Dear friends, welcome to another episode of U.S. Global Shield Today. There is a way to compromise the stability of a country without occupying its cities, destroying its command centers, or directly confronting its armed forces in a conventional battle. It is enough to strike what sustains the daily lives of millions of people: water and energy. In the modern geopolitical arena, these resources are no longer merely essential services. They have become strategic assets capable of influencing military, political, and economic decisions. This is precisely why reports of attacks allegedly attributed to Iran against power facilities and structures linked to water supply systems in the Gulf attract so much attention from international analysts. Regardless of the extent of the damage in each incident, the mere possibility of disrupting these services reveals a vulnerability that could alter strategic calculations across the region. To understand why this issue causes so much concern, it is necessary to look beyond the headlines. When most people think of the Gulf, they immediately imagine oil fields, massive refineries, oil tankers crossing the Strait of Hormuz, and cities filled with modern skyscrapers. This image is accurate, but it reveals only part of the reality. There is a silent infrastructure, rarely discussed outside specialized circles, that keeps all of this prosperity functioning every day. These are desalination plants responsible for transforming seawater into drinking water for millions of residents. Without them, much of the region's cities would simply be unable to sustain their populations, industries, hospitals, and military bases. This detail helps explain why water security has gained an increasingly important role in strategic discussions across the Middle East. Countries such as Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia are located in one of the driest regions on Earth. Unlike other parts of the world, they do not have large permanent rivers capable of supplying massive urban centers. Underground aquifers are limited and, in many cases, have high levels of salinity, or cannot keep up with the population growth of recent decades. As a result, desalination technology has moved beyond being an alternative and has become a vital necessity. In the case of Kuwait, this dependence is particularly significant. Most of the water consumed by the population is produced through seawater desalination. This means that any prolonged interruption of these facilities could create impacts far beyond the infrastructure sector. Hospitals, schools, industries, airports, military installations, and homes depend directly on this continuous supply. A plant that stops operating is not merely a technical problem. It represents an immediate reduction in the country's water supply capacity, creating pressure on strategic reserves and requiring rapid responses from authorities. It is important to clearly distinguish confirmed facts from strategic analysis. There are reports and official statements regarding incidents involving critical infrastructure during periods of regional tension. However, evaluating how these events may influence the strategic balance belongs to the field of analysis based on trends, known capabilities, and patterns observed in previous conflicts. This distinction is essential to prevent assumptions from being confused with verified events. From a military perspective, it makes sense to understand why essential civilian infrastructure has received so much attention. Over the past decades, several conflicts have demonstrated that winning a war does not depend solely on destroying enemy forces. In many cases, weakening a state's ability to function can produce equally significant effects. Power grids, communication systems, logistics centers, ports, airports, and supply facilities have become strategic components because they support both civilian life and various military operations. In many Gulf countries, desalination plants share energy infrastructure with power generation facilities, creating an integrated network. If one link in this chain suffers significant damage, the effects can spread across multiple sectors simultaneously. This characteristic transforms these facilities into sensitive points on the regional chessboard. Imagine a chain made up of dozens of links. As long as all of them remain intact, the structure can withstand enormous pressure. However, when a single important link breaks, the entire chain loses strength. Critical infrastructure works in a similar way. A localized problem can produce consequences far greater than it initially appears, especially when energy and water systems depend on the same distribution networks. From a geopolitical perspective, Iran faces a highly complex scenario. The country possesses large armed forces, significant capabilities in ballistic missile production, long-range drones, and various air defense systems. Nevertheless, many experts assess that a direct conventional war against a coalition led by the United States would represent a major challenge for Tehran. For this reason, numerous studies indicate that Iran's strategy has historically sought to use asymmetric methods to increase the cost of any confrontation for its adversaries. This assessment is part of strategic analysis and should not be interpreted as confirmation of specific intentions in each individual incident. Within this logic, increasing the perception of vulnerability among neighboring countries can create political pressure without requiring large-scale conventional confrontations. When governments need to allocate more resources to protect essential facilities, strengthen missile defense systems, and reorganize emergency plans, part of the strategic initiative shifts hands. Even if material damage remains limited, the psychological impact can influence political decisions, defense investments, and diplomatic calculations. It is like quietly moving an important piece on a chessboard, forcing the opponent to reorganize the entire board before making the next move. This dynamic helps explain why international security experts monitor not only troop movements or missile launches, but also the protection of power grids, port facilities, and water supply systems. In modern warfare, the boundary between civilian infrastructure and strategic infrastructure has become extremely narrow. An industrial complex may provide energy to entire neighborhoods while also supporting military bases, communication centers, and logistical facilities. Likewise, a desalination plant does not serve only the civilian population. It also ensures the operation of military hospitals, airports, ports, refineries, and facilities considered essential to national security. The operation of these plants reveals why their protection requires extensive planning. Different technologies are used in desalination. Some rely on thermal processes in which seawater is heated, converted into steam, and later condensed, separating salt from fresh water. Others use reverse osmosis, a method that forces water through extremely thin membranes under high pressure. Although different from one another, both systems depend on large amounts of electrical power, sophisticated equipment, high-capacity pumps, filtration systems, pipelines, seawater intake stations, and highly automated control centers. This means that simply rebuilding a damaged wall is not enough to restore the entire operation. In many cases, replacing specialized components may require time, skilled labor, and international supply chains. Another factor that increases this vulnerability is the location of these facilities. A large number of desalination plants have been built near the coastline, where seawater collection is more efficient. Coincidentally, these coastal areas also concentrate commercial ports, oil export terminals, refineries, power plants, and important logistical corridors. From a strategic perspective, this creates regions where multiple critical assets remain relatively close to one another. For military planners, this concentration represents both an advantage and a challenge. It facilitates infrastructure integration, but also increases the risk that a single event could affect multiple sectors simultaneously. If attacks against this type of infrastructure were to continue over time, a scenario that belongs to the field of analytical hypotheses and not a description of confirmed events, Gulf governments would likely be forced to reassess their defense priorities. Investments that previously focused mainly on protecting air bases or oil facilities could be expanded to include systems dedicated to defending desalination plants, power networks, and water distribution centers. This could involve new radar systems, short-range missile defense systems, coastal surveillance sensors, counter-drone capabilities, and greater integration between armed forces and civilian operators of critical infrastructure. At the same time, there is an economic dimension that is often less discussed. When the world follows tensions in the Gulf, attention usually turns immediately to the international oil market. After all, a significant portion of global energy production passes through the region, especially through the Strait of Hormuz. However, water security represents another equally important variable. If international perceptions evolve toward the idea that water supplies are also exposed to high levels of risk, investors may consider new factors when evaluating regional stability, insurance costs, industrial projects, and long-term infrastructure investments. There's also a relevant diplomatic dimension. Attacks against essential infrastructure serving civilian populations often generate intense debate within international law and multilateral organizations. Depending on the specific circumstances of each incident, different governments may interpret these events in different ways, reinforcing condemnations, calling for independent investigations, or expanding regional security cooperation mechanisms. In other words, beyond the immediate military impact, this type of event can influence political alliances and accelerate strategic agreements among countries that share similar concerns. In this context, the importance of integrated defense among the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council also continues to grow. Although each state has its own national priorities, the protection of critical infrastructure can encourage greater intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, and the development of regional early warning systems. The logic is simple. A perceived threat against an essential element of regional infrastructure tends to encourage coordinated responses, reducing collective vulnerabilities and increasing the ability to react to future crises. When observing this scenario from a broader perspective, it becomes clear that contemporary warfare resembles much less the traditional conflicts of the past and much more a constant struggle over strategic pressure points. The primary objective is not always to conquer territory. In many situations, it is enough to create sufficient uncertainty to alter an adversary's political, economic, and military decisions. Doubt itself becomes an instrument of power. The greater the uncertainty surrounding the security of essential resources, the greater the need to redirect resources toward protection, limit investments, or revise national strategies. It is precisely at this point that geopolitics reveals its most complex side. The true impact of a crisis is not always measured only by the material damage observed at the moment of the attack. Often, its deepest effects appear months later, when governments modify defense policies, companies change their investment plans, alliances become stronger, and new strategic priorities begin to guide decisions that will influence the entire region for many years. When observing this historical transformation, it becomes clear that water, energy, and technology have come to occupy a role similar to the one that fortresses, walls, and large armies represented in previous centuries. Today, a city may have modern air defense systems, highly trained armed forces, and sophisticated equipment, but it will remain vulnerable if it loses the ability to provide drinking water, to its population. This reality profoundly changes the way strategists analyze contemporary conflicts. From this perspective, the security of desalination plants is no longer just a matter of engineering or public administration and becomes part of national defense planning. In several Gulf countries, these facilities are already included in critical infrastructure protection plans, receiving constant monitoring and being considered strategic assets. However, no system is completely immune to risks. The development of drones, precision-guided missiles, cyber attacks, and sabotage operations requires continuous updates to security measures. It is also important to consider that a water crisis caused by prolonged damage to infrastructure would not affect only the civilian population. Hospitals would depend on emergency reserves, industrial sectors could reduce production, airports could face operational limitations, and various economic activities would suffer indirect impacts. In regions characterized by extremely high temperatures during much of the year, any significant reduction in water supply represents an additional challenge for public health and for the maintenance of essential services. At the same time, this situation may encourage new investments in redundancy technologies. Gulf countries have been expanding projects aimed at diversifying desalination systems, increasing water storage capacity, modernizing electrical networks, and strengthening rapid response mechanisms during emergencies. Although these initiatives do not completely eliminate risks, they can significantly reduce vulnerability in the event of localized disruptions. On the international stage, incidents involving critical infrastructure are closely monitored by powers such as the United States, China, European countries, and other nations with economic and strategic interest in the region. The Gulf remains one of the most important areas for global energy trade, maritime transportation, and various international supply chains. Consequently, any factor that increases regional instability tends to have repercussions far beyond the borders of the countries directly involved. Even so, it is essential to maintain a clear distinction between confirmed facts and analytical projections. Events that have actually been verified must be evaluated based on reliable and verifiable information. Future scenarios, on the other hand, represent analytical exercises designed to understand possible outcomes, not inevitable predictions. In geopolitics, anticipating possibilities helps governments and experts prepare responses, but it does not mean claiming that a specific outcome will occur. Perhaps the main lesson from this scenario is understanding that power in the 21st century does not depend only on the number of soldiers or the range of missiles. It is also connected to the ability to protect the systems that keep a society functioning every day. When critical infrastructure becomes the center of strategic competition, the boundary between national security, economic stability, and public well-being becomes almost impossible to separate. Like pieces in a complex chess game, water, energy, technology, and logistics begin to determine moves that often remain invisible to those who only follow the headlines. Given this scenario, one question remains open. To what extent could the protection of water infrastructure become one of the main factors in preventing an even greater escalation in the Gulf? Share your opinion in the comments, discuss your analysis of this scenario, and if this content helped you better understand the geopolitical landscape, do not forget to leave a like and follow the channel for future videos.